Good morning. I appreciate all the hearty souls who, I know some of you were partying last night, still made it in for breakfast. We do have plenty of coffee. Um, I'm Jess Sobel. I chair the Planning Committee. I'm also with MISTA. And I'd like to welcome all of you this morning. Our breakfast speaker is Diane Yentel. She's the president and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And as most of you probably know, she was supposed to be here yesterday morning, but her work in Washington is more important than the stuff we're doing here for her, and she had to testify to a committee in Congress, and hopefully she can also let us know how that is going and hopefully give us some good news. Diane's a veteran of affordable housing. She's a policy expert in that area. She's been around for nearly 2 decades, working on affordable housing issues and community development issues. She's worked with the Public Policy and Government Affairs at Enterprise Community Partners. I know that group is familiar to a lot of you. She worked with HUD and managed to, I presume, have a good time there, but escape. Nobody from HUD in the room, right? HUD gets picked on, I know, a lot, and of course so does MISTA, so it comes with the turf. She's also worked with the Massachusetts Coalition on the Homeless. She served for 3 years in the Peace Corps. So Diane has had a very varied experience. She's seen a lot of the stuff that we're all working on from a lot of different angles and perspectives. And I think that experience has served her well in her new role. I think she's a great advocate, and I welcome her to the stage. Diane?
Thank you. All right, if this mic is working, I think I'm gonna, yeah, you can all hear me? Yes? Okay, good morning. Thanks for your dedication to be here at 7:30 in the morning for this conversation. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. As you heard, my name's Diane Yentel. I head up the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and the work that we do at the coalition is all about expanding and advancing federal policy solutions to make homes affordable for the lowest income people. And we do our work with partners and members and allies across the country, including many of you here in this room today. And it's a really exciting time to be doing this work. It's a strange time because in the same moment, like right now, today, we have some of the most severe threats to all of the programs that make homes affordable for the lowest income people. Some of the most severe, really existential threats really to the entire social safety net, more severe than we faced in decades. But in the very same moment, we have extraordinary possibility to really advance towards our mission. And despite the threats, maybe because of them, over the last year or 2 years, we are building momentum, and we've really had a number of significant achievements that are made possible because of the work that all of you do. So right from the start, I want to say thank you, not just for the opportunity to be here, but to thank you all for the work that you do day in and day out, despite the threats and despite the challenges, and to thank you for your advocacy, because it really is making a difference. So if we could put my slides up, please. And the threats really are real, and the challenges are growing, and we have our work cut out for us. So the housing crisis is growing. It's reached historic heights, and it's most harming, it's most negatively impacting the lowest income people. So this is from research that the National Low Income Housing Coalition puts out every year called The Gap, and it's where we quantify the shortage of homes that are affordable and available to the lowest income people. And nationally, there's a shortage of 7 million homes affordable and available for those lowest income people. So another way of saying that is for every 10 of the lowest income seniors, people with disabilities, families with kids, and others, for every 10, there's fewer than 4 homes that are affordable and available to them. And you can see from the map that the shortage ranges from most severe to least severe. But there is no state, there's no major metropolitan area, there's no congressional district that has a sufficient supply of homes for those lowest income people. We also do research every year where we come up with what we call the housing wage. This is how much you have to earn an hour just to be able to afford to rent a modest 1 or 2 bedroom apartment. And so last year, the housing wage for a 2-bedroom apartment is over $22 an hour. And it's about $18 an hour for a 1-bedroom apartment. You can, well, I suppose you can't see, but it's a little bit lower than that in Michigan. It's close to $17 here an hour to rent a 2-bedroom apartment. So clearly these housing wages, these housing costs are far out of reach for minimum wage workers. But it's not just the minimum wage workers for whom they're out of reach. The average renter can afford a 2-bedroom apartment in 11% of US counties and can afford a 1-bedroom apartment in less than half. So this will be a challenge for the foreseeable future. The US Department of Labor puts out their projections of how many jobs are expected to grow, the jobs that our economy is producing, and will have the greatest growth over the next 10 years. These are the jobs, and 7 out of 10 of these jobs pay less than what it costs to rent a 1-bedroom apartment. So because of this shortage of homes for the lowest income people, and because of the gap between what people earn or otherwise bring in each month and what housing costs, there's nearly 8 million of the lowest income households who are paying more than half of their income towards their rent each month. And when you have such limited income to begin with, and you're paying 50, 60, 70% of it towards your rent each month, you have very little left over for all of life's other necessities. And your one financial emergency, a broken down car, a sick child, a missed day of work, away from not being able to pay the rent. So this is why we have homelessness in this country. It's why we have housing poverty. It's why, despite the best efforts of many of you here in Michigan, the numbers of people experiencing homelessness are back on the rise, as they are throughout the country for the first time in many years. So we have homelessness and we have housing poverty in this country because the programs that make homes affordable for the lowest income people have been underfunded for decades. And we have a system, a housing system such as it is in our country today, where just 1 in every 4 households, 1 in every 4 families who needs housing assistance and is eligible for it receives it. So 3 out of 4, 75% of the people who need housing assistance get none. And they're the folks who are waiting in line, adding their names to years and sometimes decades-long waiting lists, hoping to win what is essentially a housing lottery, where only the lucky 25% get the help that they need. So it's important to know that it wasn't always like this, that this isn't something that we should all expect is just a normal thing. It wasn't always like this. We would have to go back to, not that long ago, to the late 1970s to find a time when the homelessness that exists today didn't exist back then. And we actually had a small surplus of homes that were affordable and available to the lowest income people at that time. Our country housed nearly everyone. And the difference between then and now is federal spending on programs to make homes affordable. So if you look at that, the far left corner, that was the height of spending on programs. We were still building public housing. We were building project-based rental assistance. We were fully funding other programs. And if we put those dollars into today's, we'd see that in the late 1970s, at that time when we had a surplus of homes for the lowest income people, at a time when we were housing everybody, we had the authority to spend 3 times as much on HUD's budget as we do today. So there's no wonder why, since we slashed HUD's budget homelessness began and has increased ever since. And you'll see that big spike there around 2010. That was after the foreclosure crisis, and there was big one-time spending for some of HUD's and other programs. And then if we were to zoom back into that, to that bottom left-hand corner, we'd see that funding has continued to decline even more since the Budget Control Act was enacted in 2010. That was when we set these really tight spending caps for all of government spending. And HUD and other departments have had their budgets squeezed since then. We are starting to turn the corner. 2 years ago, well, really every year since this president has been in office, he's proposed drastic cuts to HUD's budget. So 2 years ago, he proposed 15% cuts to the entire budget of HUD. This year, by the way, he's proposing 20% cuts. So he proposed 15% cuts, and despite his proposal, Congress not only rejected those cuts, but increased HUD's budget by 10%, which is really unheard of for a one-time. We hadn't seen that kind of a spending increase since the foreclosure crisis, 10% increase in 1 year, and this year we maintained that increase. So this is what it looks like. This is what a 10% increase to HUD's budget looks like. It means more money to repair public housing. It means 50,000 new vouchers for people with disabilities. It means new construction dollars for housing for people with disabilities for the first time in 8 years. It means more money for home and for CDBG and beyond. And beyond the numbers, these increases, all told, together with other success we've had over the last year at the federal level, means homes for about 100,000 of the lowest income people who wouldn't have had homes without them. So this is a real achievement and something that we were able to do together through expanding our coalitions, through educating members of Congress, and through cultivating bipartisan champions in Congress, so that when the moment came, when the budget caps were lifted, they were ready. Senator Susan Collins, Republican from Maine, Senator Jack Reed, Democrat from Rhode Island, to get the largest possible share for HUD's budget, and this is what it looked like. So we still have a long way to go, because even with that 10% increase, this is what HUD's budget looks like over the last 10 years. So we have much more to do. The National Housing Trust Fund is another program that's been threatened over the last few years with elimination altogether. The president has proposed eliminating it. There have been some efforts in Congress to reduce it or to eliminate it, some other threats, and we've been able to protect it. The Housing Trust Fund, many of you know, is our country's newest housing program. It was designed precisely to meet the need that we're talking about here today. It was designed to fill the gap of homes for the lowest income people. So at its current funding level, 100% of the money goes to build and preserve homes for the lowest income people. And the first year's funding allocation of $174 million has so far built or preserved close to 2,000 units across the country. And these homes are housing some of our country's really most vulnerable people. Survivors of domestic violence, or people who were chronically homeless, youth aging out of foster care, seniors, people with disabilities, veterans. So the program's working. The only problem with the program is that it's woefully underfunded compared to the overwhelming need. So we have work to do there, too, to expand the Housing Trust Fund. And we're making progress. We have shifted the conversation over what's possible to achieve in funding for the Housing Trust Fund. So over the last year, we've had conversations, we've positioned ourselves for if comprehensive housing finance reform moves forward at some point, we're in a very strong position to expand funding for the trust fund up to $3.5 billion a year. As was said earlier, I was invited to testify before Congress yesterday at a hearing that the House Financial Services Committee had on housing as infrastructure. And that we were there to discuss a bill that Chairwoman Maxine Waters has introduced that would provide $5 billion for the Housing Trust Fund, along with $70 billion to repair public housing capital needs. And I'll just say there, too, that for many of us have foreseen an infrastructure spending package conversation in Congress for years. And all of us here in this room and beyond have been working to ensure that housing is viewed as infrastructure. Housing is infrastructure. And that if an infrastructure spending package were to move forward, that housing be included. So we've done it. I mean, we now have the chairwoman of the House Financial Services Committee and Democratic leadership, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, saying housing is infrastructure, and when and if an infrastructure spending package moves, funding for housing has to be included. So $5 billion for the Housing Trust Fund is possible there. And then there's the bill that Elizabeth Warren introduced and a companion bill in the House that would provide for $45 billion in funding for the trust fund annually for 10 years. Now, we're not likely to achieve that anytime soon, but it shifts the conversation over what's possible, and shifting that, expanding our view of what we should ask for, starting to be willing to ask for what we actually need instead of what we feel like is possible in today's political moment, means that when we get to compromise, we're that much closer to actually achieving what we need. So, you know, from the slides you've seen, from what you know from your work every day, the bad news is the crisis is getting worse. And the lowest income renters are being squeezed the most. Homelessness is increasing. The good news is that we can solve this crisis. It's a choice, right? We have the data, we have the research, we have the solutions. We have proven solutions to ending homelessness and housing poverty. What we lack is the political will to fund those solutions at the scale necessary. And so much of the work that we are focusing on at the National Low Income Housing Coalition is building that political will. And there's a few ways that we do it. So one is we have to expand our coalitions to include more than people who work in housing, people who are living in precarious conditions in housing. The founder of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, Cushing Dolbear, said many, many years ago, housing is too important to be left to housers alone. Right? And she was right. And the research and I think all of our collective understanding is catching up to that idea. And today we benefit from this growing body of research that makes a really compelling case for how central housing affordability is to the outcomes of so many other sectors. Right? We know that when we are affordably housed, we're healthier, our kids do better in school, we earn more over our lifetimes, we even live longer. So we started asking ourselves the question, given all of this research, whether leaders in other sectors outside of the housing field were as convinced as we are that they won't be able to achieve their goals of healthier kids or kids doing better in school until more people are affordably housed, that they'd be willing to join us in our advocacy for more resources to end homelessness and end housing poverty. And the answer was yes. And so we pulled together a steering committee of what we call the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign. We launched this campaign last year. We have a steering committee of mostly non-housing organizations. So we have groups like National Education Association, which is the largest teachers union in the country, tens of thousands of teachers who come to DC every year to talk about school funding and other issues like that. These teachers are seeing kids churning in and out of their classrooms because of homelessness or housing instability, and they're finding that this is impacting not just those individual children and their families, but it's impacting all the kids in the classroom. And it's impacting the teacher's ability to teach. And so they've joined our effort to say we need more federal resources to end homelessness and ending housing poverty. We have from the civil rights community, NAACP and Unidos US, who see clearly the connections between segregated communities and a lack of access to opportunity, and how housing is key to reversing that. So they've joined the steering committee. We have healthcare groups like Community Catalyst that was at the forefront of getting the Affordable Care Act enacted, and other groups are some of the newest members of our steering committee are National League of Cities, National Association of Social Workers, and one that's not even, I don't even have their logo up there because they're so new, but a group called Just Leadership, which is led by formerly incarcerated people working towards criminal justice reform. And they see the centrality of housing affordability in their efforts too. So all of these new, really impressive in their own field leaders who are now adding their voices, adding their capacity, adding their networks for who they mobilize to work with us to push Congress to do more. I really believe that if we get this right, that this can be a tipping point in the work that we do to expand beyond. It can't just be people who care about housing saying we need more housing. It has to be more, and these partners are joining us now. We also build the political will and elevate our issues through connecting local actions under one message and one clear brand and push for Congress to do more. So 2 years ago, we had our first National Housing Week of Action. We call it Our Homes, Our Voices. And that year, the first time we ever tried it, we had about 60 events in communities across the country. And the events range from rallies to movie viewings to visits with members of Congress in their local offices to site visits to visit affordable housing and beyond. So we had about 60 events. Last year we did it again and we doubled our impact. We had over 120 events in 60 communities across the country. We had 95 members of Congress participate in Week of Action events. So we're doing it again this year. It'll be May 30th through June 5th, and I hope here in Lansing and throughout the state that you hold events and work with us. We'll work to amplify your events. Let us know what you're doing. Let us know what you're planning, and we'll weave together all of the work. Again, this is really making a difference. These are the kind of activities that get members of Congress to understand how important these issues are in their districts and in their states. We're also building the political will through elevating the issue in the national dialogue. So at the coalition, we measure the number of news stories that we help shape in some way. They quote our staff or they cite our research. And you can see the tremendous increase in the number of stories on the housing crisis over the last few years. You see this, right, in your local communities. You pick up the local paper and there's a story about housing affordability in a way that there wasn't before. This is partly a reflection of the housing crisis itself, right, and the degree of severity it's reached. It's also a reflection of the work that we're doing together, because these stories that are being told are telling the housing crisis from our view of where it starts and where it ends, which is homes for the lowest income people. This has a tremendous impact as well, especially the national stories are great, but it's the local stories really that have the greatest impact, because those are the ones that members of Congress are reading. And those are the ones that are helping them see which issues, among many, they ought to be prioritizing when they go back to Washington, D.C. Another way that we work to build the momentum and to build the political will is really as foundational as working to help low-income renters, people experiencing homelessness, participate in our democracy. So we have a project called Our Homes, Our Votes with lots of materials that you can check out, but this is why we're doing it. So many of us have asked ourselves for many years, what do we have to do to get housing affordability to be at the top of the priority list of policymakers? So this looks at, if you look at on your right, 2016, the darker line is the percentage of homeowners who voted in national elections, and the darker one is the percentage of renters. And when you look at it by income, the difference is even more clear. The right-hand side, the 74% of people with incomes over $100,000 voted, and 38% of people with incomes below $20,000 voted. So when we ask ourselves that question of what do we have to do, why is rental housing not at the top of priority lists for policymakers? This is why. This is why, to the extent that we have a national housing policy at all, this is why it's skewed so heavily towards higher income homeowners, because they're who shows up. They are who registers. They are who shows up to vote, and policymakers know it. So there's a lot of reasons for this. There are a lot of barriers and obstacles, but we have to do all that we can to change this dynamic and work with low-income renters so that they are seen, low-income renters and their allies, so that we are seen as a powerful voting bloc. That is what will make the difference in elevating rental housing to the top of the priority list. So all of this is having an impact. We've had some, despite it all, despite this really challenging time, we've had some tremendous wins over the last year. I talked about just a few of them at the federal level. At the state and local level, they're equally impressive. And we are starting now to see, as we did in the 2018 election, that housing is something that people show up to vote because of. And the number of ballot initiatives, there were over 24 ballot initiatives nationally, throughout the country, that won in 2018. Altogether, it's over $10 billion of new resources for housing for the lowest income people. California really led the way, but there were other ballot initiatives in Austin, Texas, in North Carolina, in Oregon, in Seattle, that meant new resources and new resident protections and new momentum, right? Every one of these wins creates a sense of possibility, and it builds new partners and new momentum for us to achieve more. The public is catching on as well, too. So through the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign, we just about a month ago commissioned a poll through Hart Research, which is one of the leading political polling organizations in the country. And we released a poll, and we commissioned a poll, and the results are really exciting and promising. It's catching on. 85% of the public, and this is bipartisan, 85% of the public believe that affordable housing, ensuring that everybody has a decent, safe, and affordable home, should be at the top of the priority list. This is a big increase from previous years. I don't think we've ever seen numbers like that. 8 in 10 people in the United States, again on a bipartisan basis, say the President and Congress should take major action to make housing more affordable. And we polled solutions. We polled, do you agree that we need major investments in building homes affordable for the lowest income people, in expanding rental assistance, in creating cash assistance programs to help people avoid eviction? And all of those solutions polled very high. So the public is catching on as well. And members of Congress are responding. They're seeing the stories in their papers. They're seeing the actions in their communities. They're hearing from constituents more and more that housing and homelessness is their top concern, and they're responding. some of these members up here are not actually members of Congress anymore. I need to update this slide. But this shows just over the last less than a year, major housing bills that have been introduced in Congress, the likes of which we haven't seen in generations. I talked about Elizabeth Warren's bill, $45 billion a year for the trust fund. Senators Booker and Harris have legislation to create a renter's tax credit, tens of billions of dollars a year. Maxine Waters is proposing $5 billion for the trust fund. It's a whole new conversation among members of Congress, where for so long, even our biggest champions have introduced legislation mostly that sort of nibbles around the edges, small amounts, small increases. And now we have members, again on a bipartisan basis, who are willing to really recognize that we need major investments and to put forward bills to do so. So it's really a new moment for us as advocates to work with all of these champions who are willing to be so bold and so ambitious. And of course, some of these senators, especially up there in the top left corner, have something else in common beyond being senators, and of course that's that they're running for president, which gives us another incredible opportunity that we are seizing. And again, for many years, for decades, some of us have worked, many of you here in this room, to try to elevate affordable housing into the presidential elections. And we've honestly had very little success. I mean, I remember many times, and some of you may too, watching debates in previous elections or seeing town halls and just waiting and hoping for a moment when they might say anything related to our issue. And they would say like, oh, she said house. They're talking about our issue. Or they said neighborhood. Yay, they're talking about our issue. We've had almost no success despite incredible efforts to do it. It's a completely different situation right now. And already, the presidential elections are obviously just getting started. And already we've seen housing, affordable housing, the housing crisis solutions talked about on the campaign trail more than we have in entire presidential campaign seasons in the past. And I want to show a video to give you a sense of that.
As housing secretary, I visited 100 different communities, big and small, all across our nation. From downtown Los Angeles to rural Wisconsin to San Juan, Puerto Rico, and the Pine Ridge Reservation. And this much is clear: we have a housing affordability crisis in this country. Today, too many families are spending more than half of their income on rent. And that means that more families are doubling up, sleeping on the couches of relatives, or even sleeping on the streets. But you know what? You hardly ever hear about that in politics. That's going to change. We will invest in housing that's affordable to the middle class and to the poor. And I know that we can turn things around.
A person working a full-time job in this nation at minimum wage still lives in poverty. It's a normalcy that's crept into this country where in every county, there is not one county in America where a person making minimum wage can afford a two-family home.
How many people in here worry about the rising cost of housing? Yeah, a lot of hands, right? So here's the deal. New construction in America has moved to the high end. So if you're rich, there's a lot of housing opportunities. But if you're middle class, working poor, or poor, what's basically happened is there hasn't been much new housing coming in. The government has backed out from what it was doing. And the consequence is housing is deteriorating, and at the same time, the price is going up. So what can we do about it? I'll tell you exactly what we can do about it. We can build 3.2 million new housing units across this country. Urban, rural, we can do this.
You live in a really high-cost area. And it's really hard. I mean, we have an affordable housing crisis in this country. And I'm sure you know, based on where you live, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. It's another thing we need to do is we need to put more resources behind affordable housing. I introduced a bipartisan affordable housing bill as part of comprehensive housing finance reform that would put about another $6 billion, it was bipartisan, put another $6 billion out in the communities for affordable housing. So I think things like making housing more affordable, creating kind of a universal health care system, doubling the earned income tax credit, right? That's an agenda for working families.
You're here in Mississippi, you're focusing on housing for people who are struggling. You have a plan to try to tackle that. You say it's going to help lower rent. How does that work?
So I have a proposal to build about 3 million new housing units across America.
Does the volume go out? Well, that's Bernie Sanders saying we should build more housing across the country.
On the issue of affordable housing and rent, I'm proposing that if folks are paying more than 30% of their income in rent plus utilities, they should get up to a $6,000 tax credit so they can afford to get through each month. I'm proposing that no American family should have to work more, and no person should have to work more than one job to be able to put food on the table and pay the bills.
Yeah. And we'll work to make sure every American has a safe, decent, and affordable place to live in this country.
The idea is that we need to make a real investment in housing. In the same way that we think about health care as a basic human right, having a decent and safe place to live should be a basic human right.
The Rent Relief Act says that if you spend more than 30% of your income on rent and utilities, you'll get a portion of that money back. It's that straightforward. This is America, and I believe every family deserves the security of being able to keep a roof over their head.
I believe that we can build a country where no one is forgotten, no one is left behind.
So there's a lot we need to do. Certainly as president, I would invest in trying to increase the supply of affordable housing, because right now there's a lot of NIMBYism where a lot of cities are like, hey, I love the idea of affordable housing, but if you try and build it around my rich people, then they'll get very upset, so I don't want to do it. So what we have to do is we have to lift some of the zoning restrictions on construction of affordable housing, and that would be a priority of mine as president.
Isn't that incredible? It's just like a whole new world right now. We've never had this before, where we had so many presidential candidates talking about our issues. And if they've talked about it, it's in that compilation. For some of them, we had to cut out. They're talking about it so much that we couldn't just show it in that video. But if they're not on that video, it means they haven't talked about it yet on the campaign trail. And so the work that we're going to do is to keep encouraging this conversation, working to shape the solutions that all candidates put forward, so that whoever our next president is, they prioritize ending homelessness and housing poverty. We're compiling all of these clips, we're keeping track of all of them, we're planning forums, coffees with the candidates in New Hampshire and Iowa and beyond. We're putting together materials to help all of you when candidates come to the state to ask the questions that we want answered. So if you hear, we're using the hashtag #OurHomes/OurVotes2020. You can take a look at that and see all the conversation that's happening already. And if you hear candidates talking about affordable housing, try to capture it, use the hashtag, send it out, so we can keep this conversation going. The more that we encourage candidates, and the more the candidates see that they get good press, that people are excited, that voters are interested, the more they'll keep talking about it. And the more this will become actually a top priority in the campaigns. Just on Monday, there were 2 op-eds by presidential candidates on affordable housing. Bernie Sanders wrote one in Las Vegas, and Kamala Harris wrote one in USA Today, and both of them focusing on the housing needs of the lowest income renters. So we have this incredible opportunity right now. So all of this together, I hope, shows you that despite the incredible challenges, we have these tremendous opportunities right now. It's really exhilarating possibility. And personally, having worked in this field for many, many years, and even with the challenges that we have today, recognizing the scale of the problem, I've never felt so hopeful that we will achieve big change together, because in fact we already are. And it's a matter of us continuing to do what we're doing. So I want to thank all of you again for showing up here so early in the morning, for your work day in and day out. You do some of the hardest work in the country, and you do it with overwhelming demand and dwindling resources. And I appreciate that hard work that you do. And on top of that, you manage to advocate, and I want to thank you for that as well. Thank you for your advocacy. It's making a difference, and together we can do more. So thank you for your advocacy today and in the months and years to come. It's never been more important. So thanks so much, and I'm happy to take some questions if people have any. I think we have, I can't see, we have time for questions, yeah? No? Oh, we're out of time?
If you've got time, if you need to go to your sessions, go ahead and go to sessions, but if you want to stick around and ask her questions,
Oh, did I go that long? Wow.
we can do that, or we can actually be a little more informal and come down.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to take questions, yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
And see you back at 12:15 or 12 o'clock for lunch in Stephanie Land.